Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to review Season 3, Episode 9 of American Gods. Not realizing that this show was not going to be coming to an end via, season finale ending, I guess. Because reasonably, I guess, this show either wants to extend at a certain point to ultimately then finally end after 3 seasons, or do whatever it wants to do. Stretch this show out, be renewed, I don't know. I'm just ultimately reporting on a episode that I had seen. And so ultimately, if you guys don't have a free means to ultimately see stars or by and large whatever, go into Movie Pro. Go into the app Movie Pro, and otherwise go and ultimately watch this episode for free. I honestly think that this episode honestly does matter, and this episode does conclude quite a few things if you saw early episodes, but it also just kind of concludes a lot of things. So I think it's actually an important episode compared to anything else. There is some kind of dialogue points where ultimately I was just kind of like, okay, let's get to the point. But because when looking at it, there's some dialogue in here where ultimately I was just like, ba 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 ba, because it's a lot of just stretching for dialogue in some of these scenes to get us to the actual good parts, to get us to the actual important key moments. And so I have to say that this episode was actually a good episode. I actually liked this episode because I thought it was interesting. I think how I'm going to have to review this is I'm going to have to probably focus on key stories first, and then go into this towards the end goal, which is the very tail end or the very end of this episode, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, we have it to where in this episode, Laura is to be basically trained on how to use a Odin spear. Of course, we end up having it to where reasonably Laura is kind of back and forth about the spear, and so that ultimately is a very cryptic like way of talking about this episode. We end up having it to where bizarrely, we end up having Shadow Moon end up being a Nancy Drew-esque like person that has to solve a mystery in this episode. And it also seems that we have the original Mr. World come back to this episode, so that is great. We have seemingly both Technical Boy and Odin doing things out of the ordinary in this episode. And so really we have it to where reasonably this episode really gets really interesting in all actuality. Like if you haven't been watching this whole entire time, I guess now is a time to come back. Like especially if you kind of watch the early episodes. Like a lot of the stuff that happened in between like the very first early episodes and this, it's going to be a lot of arduous process to get through, but at least this episode seems like a very key moment that actually seems, so you gotta like muddle through your way through a lot of garbage episodes to get to here. Or if people like the last episodes, I apologize, but it is what it is. So we end up having it to where there is a conclusion to that missing person that ended up being on this season. We end up having, so if you did not know anything about that and you're just now tuning in, well then this will conclude that whole story. We also have a seemingly big moment that could quite possibly lead to a big surprise, I guess, trying to say this cryptically, towards the very tail end of this episode that people are going to be like, huh? Surprise? Yes. Because there is a way of kind of figuring out like where exactly this is going to go. It seems like this episode they tried to do like quite a bit of surprises in this episode. Like, that person? That those things are happening? I'm surprised. What is happening with ultimately Marguerite, which is ultimately Shadow Moon's property manager in Shadow Moon? What is going on here? Are they finally sealing the deal? Or are they going to ultimately just say, like, you know what? Cryptically, ultimately saying all this stuff. I enjoy this episode just because there is some arduous process, maybe even to go through this episode, but it's a means to an ends, seemingly for this story, and I kind of like the ending of this episode, just because I'm like, oh man, like I'm kind of relieved. I'm kind of relieved, sadly enough, about how this episode ends. Cause there's one thing where it could turn into something bad, something awful, and there's another thing where ultimately it's just like, wow, that's a surprise. Like, I didn't know they were going to do that at the tail end of this episode. So now it's about that time to go at the spoiler point of this episode, and then we'll get to the big hoopla about what the tail end of this episode is. Check out Movie Pro so you can watch this episode for free, or otherwise just, if you already have a Star subscription, if you've been watching along all since whenever, and you're like, thank God for this episode, then by all means, go ahead and check it out if you have not caught it yet. So, spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this episode. So, I think I'm going to key up the Laura story first and get to a certain point in that story and then lob off. And then we're going to go into Shadow Moon's story and then get to where that seemingly ends in this episode. And then ultimately we're going to go into what's going on with Odin in this episode. And then do little bits and pieces with Odin's thing going on with other people. Like Technical Boy has has a little bit of interesting things going on here, but that character also just really, like, who cares with this episode, because it's like, yeah, he has the only thing, like, I guess we'll get to Technical Boy first. So Technical Boy, ultimately with his head grabber thing on, we end up having it to where Mr. World appears in this episode to ultimately say, hey, I'll let you out. Wouldn't that be great if, like, I let you out today? And so we end up having it to ultimately, it seems that Mr. World's goons ultimately are to seemingly let Technical Boy out, and we end up having it to where Technical Boy ends up going and attacking these minions and ends up trying to kill both of them. And I thought that was an interesting thing that happens with Technical Boy. But that's about a bulk of load of it, about what really happens with Technical Boy. I guess he is coming to his senses, or maybe he is going to switch sides. I don't know. Maybe Technical Boy is going to be on his own. Who knows? But let's get to Laura. Because ultimately, the beginning of this episode ties in, or the beginning of this episode has Odin stuff, but I'm not going to quite get there yet. So we end up having it to ultimately Laura is to seemingly be driving around with Doyle, which was the bartender that I had mentioned in the previous episode. We ultimately have it to where reasonably Laura and Doyle are seemingly coming up with a game plan, because reasonably Doyle is mentioning to her, it's like, you need to get trained on how to use this spear. It's not something that you can just easily pick up and just chuck and and like nobody's business. Like there has to be some like teaching involved. So we end up having them driving off to ultimately go into training mode of chucking a spear at a wall. So we end up having it to where Laura is consistently trying to chuck this spear, and this spear is going nowhere. Like this spear is just like going maybe 10 feet and then dropping. So we end up having it to where Laura is losing confidence, and ultimately it seems that Laura is just like, well, like I need to do this because there's a lot of back and forth going on about whether to kill Mr. Wednesday or not between Laura, but we end up having it to where Laura is ultimately saying like I need to kill Mr. Wednesday or otherwise the techno Nazis are gonna come after me, and Shadow Moon and Salim ultimately to try and kill us all, so I need to do this. So we end up having it to where Doyle ultimately decides to loan uh, Laura back her lucky coin. And so we end up having it to where Laura takes the spear yet again to ultimately chuck it, and it goes well way further than previous, and she ultimately goes way farther than her target with said spear. So we ultimately have it to where I think now is at that point in time where we could still go into a little bit more of this. So I was ultimately thinking like, is there more? Yes, there is. So we end up having it to where the back and forth discussion about ultimately like about what is to go on, how they are to go about this. We have it to where eventually that Laura realizing her mortality or that she could quite possibly die justifiably if this is to happen to go up against Odin. Laura is to go to Doyle and ultimately ask him if like she could basically sleep with him because she wants to feel wanted, she wants to feel needed, be like because the last time she had ever felt that way was with Dane Cook's character. So we end up having it to ultimately Laura is almost going to have some passionate love time with Doyle, but Laura ends up pulling away and saying like, you know what, no, like I think this is wrong, uh, like I think this was a mistake. And Doyle ultimately mentions it's like, well, what about my feelings at the point? It's like, well, doesn't matter. Laura is just like, no. So in the very last episode, we have an entire room of people just humping it out. But in this episode, I guess a tease of sorts has to be put on within this episode, I guess, for reasons. So now we ultimately have it to where now is a point of where we have to start getting into other people's stories. So let's get into Shadow Moons. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly Shadow Moon is to eventually go out and ultimately adventure, and we end up having it to where Shadow Moon is seemingly going at this festival of sorts, and eventually he is to see a ice sculpture who had kind of looked like the god that ultimately he had seen in the ice previously. It seems that this ice sculpture is ultimately giving him a gold coin, reminding him of the time that he had fell on the ice rink, and ultimately the god of sorts had given him a gold coin that is to have been slid all the way to this car. So we end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is to go and talk to Marguerite and to ultimately mention to her that ultimately Marguerite, his property manager, ultimately confesses to confesses to her that ultimately he had went to Florida to go and get closure with Darren for Marguerite. And we ultimately have it to where Marguerite is kind of very upset about that, and ultimately uh, Shadow Moon is like, well, hey, like, I'm sorry, kind of thing. And so ultimately, this is to all spin off into eventually where Shadow Moon is to eventually talk to Marguerite about about what Marguerite is going to do next at the end of all of this. And Marguerite is to eventually mention that she thinks that she is going to move on to Michigan. And ultimately, Shadow Moon, I think, mentions or references a popular bookstore that ultimately he knows of. And ultimately, we end up having it to where Marguerite is like, well, hey, like, if you were to ever be at that bookstore, look me up, kind of thing. Ultimately mentioning that like Shadow Moon was ultimately going to offer to go with her to Michigan, and she said no. She looked at him. She's like, no. And so Shadow Moon is ultimately just like, oh, okay, well, I guess. Hey, I know a good bookstore in Michigan. And so yeah, so it kind of feels like they're breaking up from what Shadow Moon had done behind Marguerite's back, and ultimately we have it to where that kind of resolves that relationship. And so, like the whole dialogue that is honestly going at this point between Marguerite and Shadow Moon in this episode is just like ba 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 ba, because towards the end of this, it's just kind of like a means to end to have these two break up because it was never really and truly meant to be. Because I honestly think, with the way of which that this episode is going, I really think that eventually this show was to eventually tie Shadow Moon back with Laura, or to ultimately have Laura and Shadow Moon ultimately go at odds with one another. Quite possibly, who is to know by the tail end of this episode, of which I'm going to spoil. So, we end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is to go and seemingly have these clues of sorts that are ultimately going to tell him exactly where to go to seemingly figure out exactly where this missing person, Allison, had gone missing. So we end up having it where ultimately Shadow Moon is to go into these books, and ultimately, because a thing of snow had dropped upon these books within this house with no hole in it. And so we end up having it to where Shadow Moon ultimately picks up these books and ultimately starts scrolling through them. It seems that we end up having it to where we find out there seems to be consistent consistent missing persons around a certain time, or a certain uh, time of year, uh, during different years. So it's based like, for example, if Allison was gone on December 23rd or something, or 22nd, we would have 4 to 5 other people that were basically to have gone missing around that exact same time, seemingly for years. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is to go to Chad, who is the sheriff of this town, to ultimately ask him or kind of start speculating. Hey, Chad, you know what? I've just started to notice that it seems that there have been people consistently through the years of this town had gone missing. And ultimately, we have to where Chad is kind of fluffing it off as a coincidence, and ultimately saying, like, what, are you a sheriff now? And so ultimately, Shadow Moon is otherwise really just thinking that it's like, dude, I guess I'm not gonna have his help. I guess I'm not gonna figure this all out. So we eventually seemingly have it to where, since the coin clue was to take Shadow Moon, um, to that car, we end up having it to where Shadow Moon, goes back onto seemingly thin ice to lead him back to that car that was otherwise, seemingly being on thin ice and was going to, break soon. So we end up having Shadow Moon, who is, going like, okay, well, it seems that this coin had come from the trunk of this, ice sculpture, so maybe there is something in the trunk of this car. And so ultimately, we have it to where Shadow Moon is to try to get into this car to pop the trunk. He ends up popping the trunk and he ends up finding, of course, a dead girl into the back of the trunk. We end up having it to where eventually the car is to eventually go and crash through the ice, ultimately, pushing Shadow Moon into the ice as well. And so we end up finding out that within this ice that there are numerous spirits of all the missing persons that Shadow Moon has seen. And so now we are led to believe that the person who had this car is the person who had, been the culprit of, of these missing people. So we end up having it where, uh, Shadow Moon is to go and meet, Anne Marie Hiselman, seemingly the person that ultimately we had met on the very early, portion of the season, the girl that had, uh, been a seemingly almost general like store. She had movie rentals and all kinds of things and whatever. And, she is kind of, like seemingly a kind of a tier person of this town, like a top person in this town, where ultimately she kind of knows everybody and so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon is to ultimately go and talk to her to ultimately kind of figure some things out. And when I mean figure something out, I mean solve a case. So we end up having it to where Shadow Moon is to ultimately talk to Anne Marie. And so he ends up going to her and ultimately mentioning that, hey, like you left that car there. And so, like, you are the person that has been taking all these people and, and making them all disappear. Why? We end up having it to ultimately Anne Marie is ultimately confessing to Shadow Moon right then and there. Ultimately, to mention how Anne Marie knows of Shadow Moon and ultimately knows of Odin and everything like that. We end up having it to where Anne Marie ultimately mentions how she had to go and sacrifice all these people, to this god, so ultimately this town would kind of prosper and everything along those lines. And while she is ultimately confessing all this, we have, Chad, who is ultimately going to walk on in and just arrest, Anne Marie, but that isn't going to quite all go all that easy. We end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon is to get up, and Anne Marie is ultimately to take Shadow Moon down, and ultimately we have it to where Anne Marie is starting to walk, towards Chad. To ultimately Chad is starting to light her up with bullets, and that is to seemingly do nothing. And so we are left to a kind of stopping point right there, and that is to go on to what is to be now Odin's story of this episode, because that's really how this all kind of, gets going at one point, and so on and so forth. So, Odin. What is going on with the Odin in this episode? So, Odin ultimately opens up this episode, and he is to go and talk to his fiance, like ultimately mentioning about their plans, what they are orchestrating. We ultimately have it to where, like Odin's fiance is to ultimately mention to Odin, it's like, hey, when are you actually going to sleep? And we end up having it to where Odin says like, well, I'll sleep when I'm dead. So we end up having it to where ultimately Odin is to go and seemingly have a conversation with Chernobog. Chernobog is back in this episode. We ultimately have it to where Odin is to talk to Chernobog and ultimately mention that I think it's a good time for them to call for peace. That ultimately it's a time for this war to be over. And so recently we have it to where Chernobog is like, are you kidding me? Like, what happened to you? Like, if anything, like, Chernobog is like, no, like, if anything, like, there are people that still believe in us, and because we're gods, and there are people out there that still believe in us, uh, and so no, this war like has to continue, and so on and so forth. And so Odin is sitting firm on wanting to call a truce, to call a peace. And so Chernobog is ultimately going along with him and saying, okay, sure. Like, if anything, like, I'm your right hand man, so let's go and do this. Let's get it over with. Let's see what ultimately Mr. World has got to say about this. So, and I think I covered all the technical boy stuff, so, like, that is all good and well and done. So, we end up having it to where reasonably that Odin is to go with Chernobog to ultimately go and seek out Mr. World to ultimately have a peace. So we end up having it to where Odin goes to Mr. World, and so okay, hey, how what can we do to ultimately get this thing finished, get a peace? Like, what can we do? And we ultimately have it to where Mr. World ultimately mentions it's like, well, the way that you can be able to afford peace is with your lives. Basically saying that Mr. World is still wanting to kill every single one of these old gods in order to create peace. Because we have it to where Mr. World is ultimately saying that he basically wants these gods to ultimately have it to where absolutely no one ever believes in them ever again, and to basically just establish dominance for them just winning over them. And so we end up having it to where Odin and Chernobog are just like, well, this isn't really truly a peace. Like, I'm peacing out of here. I'm goodbye. So we end up having it to where Odin and Chernobog, considering there is no peace, there is only going to be war. They end up walking out of this supposedly peace treaty to end up having it to where ultimately Laura is there. Laura is there to otherwise surprise Odin. We ultimately have it to where Laura is to go and try to take her spear and make her way to Odin. So we end up having it to where reasonably that Chernobog is ultimately trying to prevent either Doyle or Laura from trying to attack either one of them, kill either one of them, and so we end up having it to where Chernobog ends up going and swinging his hammer against Doyle, and Laura ends up throwing her spear and giving her lucky coin to Doyle so that way he could disappear and teleport away. And we ultimately see the spear continually in slow motion, like keep on coming, keep on going. And we end up having it to where said Odin's spear lands into Odin's stomach, ultimately having it to where Odin is to fall, seemingly to his death. And that is the way of which that this episode is to end, with Odin dying. Ultimately to probably tell us that Shadow Moon is probably going to take on the mantle of the old gods for his father, and maybe have a quarrel with Laura. Told me, said, hey, like, I loved you, but you killed my father. Maybe that could quite possibly happen. If that ultimately goes down, that is going to be some epic stuff. And that will be a real, true, legitimate way to end this show and have it just be an epic thing to end the season on or whatever. But yeah, so Odin is supposedly to be dead. We are to assume. But then again, there's any number of things that could quite possibly happen here. Because supernatural things, you know. I was just kind of like godsmacked about, like, seriously? Like, Odin is now dead. I was kind of happy about this because I think Odin's character, I was just like, man, like, I liked him in the beginning, but, like, the longer that we went about here, I was just kind of like, yeah, I did. I just, like, it just kind of, like, the guy was just kind of just shuffling his feet about this whole war situation, and really so was Mr. World. So nobody was, like, they were, like, at first getting their pieces together, but then after that they're just like, meh, like, we're just gonna just have a bunch of empty words or empty promises, and reasonably, like, nothing is really gonna go anywhere until this moment here, to where I guess we can have it to where Mr. World is ultimately going to come to Laura and just be like, okay, well, hey, like, you lived up to your promise, and so here's the promised land. So I'm assuming that Mr. World probably will still have Laura under his thumb, so to speak. And I think that Laura is not going to get away with this all that easy. We end up having to where I think Mr. World is ultimately going to say, like, well, I think I'm going to have to kill Shadow Moon. Like, I killed the father, so I need to kill the son. And so ultimately that it could ultimately break down into, like, that anyone that had any poor choice of words to say against Mr. World ultimately will leave this world in blood. It'll be bloody, it'll be horrific and whatever. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say about this episode. A lot of surprises in here. I was not quite thinking that we were going to conclude a lot of things, or or really get to anywhere in this episode, because ultimately I haven't seen an episode that really got to anywhere in a while. Really, I was surprised. But it was a good surprise. It was a good, like, yeah, finally we're getting somewhere with the show. Really, this show is actually worth watching, finally. And I was actually happy about what was to go on here for the most part, with the exception of Shadow Moon and his property manager, how that had to resolve. Because we end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon was ultimately in the. Yeah. Good God. I'm just trying to finish this up here. Good God, phone. That's what happens when you get a billion spam callers or whatever. So we end up having it to where ultimately Shadow Moon was in the ice, and the thing that he thought about before he was going to quite possibly die was ultimately being with Marguerite, ultimately in that jacuzzi, and like she was choking him in this bizarrish dream that he was having, and then eventually that was to wake him back up into the ice and the water. Ultimately, to see all these ghosts appear, to ultimately get him to realize, like, oh hey, yeah, like all these people have gotten missing, and I guess that um, having Shadow Moon, seeing all these spirits there, had ultimately either one, let them all loose because they had gotten some closure or something like that. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say about this review, this episode. And ultimately, if there's, I don't know how many more are to lead into probably finishing this up, I would probably assess it's got to be either 10 or 12, uh, considering now we've gone out of the different 8 episode kind of approach. So, yeah, let's see what happens for these episodes because hopefully they're going to be worthwhile and worth watching. Um, I hope. Let's get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.